Jews like to come up with many names for the same thing, just to keep things interesting. So one of the names of Rosh Hashanah is Yom Haaziq, the day of remembering. Every year, with the turning of the year, we invite the past into conversation with the present. Many of us know about the ritual side of this. In these days, we confess our past mistakes. We ask for forgiveness from those we wronged. The great sage Moses Maimonides, though, takes things even further. He says, on every Yom Kippur, we remember and confess, again, every past mistake that we have already confessed on every past Yom Kippur. Does that sound a little extreme to you? If it does, you are not alone. But in a way, it can be quite liberating too. Rather than living every day in the shadow of our past, we have a standing appointment this day, every year, a certain annual spiritual checkup, so to speak. If we've made peace with one another after Yom Kippur, then we get to release those memories back into deep storage. A new year begins, a new story unfolds, and thank goodness for that, because, well, as Mark Twain put it, a clear conscience is the sure sign of a bad memory. We all know how humbling it can be to own up to our own mistakes, but we do not always admit how hard it can be to forgive others for theirs. The day that forever changed forgiveness for me was June 19th, 2015. In Charleston, South Carolina, a white man had entered an historically black church and joined a small Bible study group for about an hour. Afterwards, as many of you know the story, he took out a handgun and methodically murdered the 9 human beings who had welcomed him. He was quickly apprehended, and just 48 hours later, he found himself face to face with families of his victims. Now, remarkably, when it was their turn to speak to him at court, they did not curse him. They did not scream at him. Instead, many stood to forgive him. Among them was Nadine Collier, who had lost her 70-year-old mother, Ethel Lance. Her voice breaking with grief, she said, "I forgive you. You took something really precious away from me. I will never talk to her again. I will never be able to hold her again. But I forgive you and have mercy on your soul. It hurts me. It hurts a lot of people. But God forgive you and I forgive you." Our country watched a shockingly and disturbingly similar scenario unfold again just last week in a Dallas courtroom. 18-year-old Brad John asked the judge's permission to hug Amber Geiger, the former police officer convicted of murdering his older brother, Botham John, as he sat alone in his apartment eating ice cream. Addressing the court, younger brother Brant forgave Geiger with a tearful embrace. Really? Could these grieving loved ones really be ready to forgive? The pain was still so fresh, I felt indignant on their behalf. Yet, I also found myself deeply moved by their compassion and their conviction. They felt that their faith demanded forgiveness, however painful. One reason I find these incidents so jarring is the absence of mutuality. In the Charleston case in particular, the shooter remained utterly unrepentant. In Judaism, repentance and forgiveness are two sides of the same coin. Offenses between people, averot ben adam lechavero in Hebrew, must be resolved between people. There's no getting around it. Only after admitting to the offense, confessing it, apologizing, and beginning to make repair, may one ask forgiveness. There are seldom shortcuts here. On the other hand, who among us would not want to feel unconditionally loved, imperfections and all? Rabbi Larry Kushner shares the story of his young daughter whose bowl of cereal crashes to the ground, spilling milk and scattering clay shards everywhere. Terror darts across the little one's face, first from the shock of the event itself and then from the fear of the expected retribution. Yet, all it takes is a gentle look from Dad for her to know that all is forgiven. All it takes are these gentle words, "Everyone makes mistakes," and she is comforted. She did not know that we can all be forgiven, that little girl. We can all be forgiven sometimes even before we can think to ask. That kind of love is a wonderful gift when it can be given with an open heart and without inflicting self-harm. Now, if forgiveness were easy, the High Holiday Prayer Book probably wouldn't need to remind us so often to do it. On some level, I think we all know that whenever we can forgive, we should. And not only because it is a good and generous thing to do, but because we will eventually all want forgiveness too. Throughout life, we all find ourselves playing the roles of both plaintiff and defendant. Whether by malice or mistake, we will hurt others, and others will hurt us, and not only once or twice. Judaism is very pragmatic, I think, on the topic of human nature. To paraphrase the great sage Maimonides, we all have the potential to be as righteous as Moses or as wicked as Pharaoh. But if you read the Torah carefully, you'll see that even Moses has a little bit of an anger problem, and even Pharaoh penitently begs forgiveness from him. We get pairs like this throughout the Torah. Sarah and Hagar, Isaac and Ishmael, or one of my personal favorites, the brothers Jacob and Esau, whose story we will revisit later. Religious school likes to make all of these pairs into simple morality tales, but the original stories are often full of depth and complexity. Good people act selfishly. Villains start as victims. Similarly, there are few absolute heroes or villains in real life. We all need to forgive and be forgiven over and over and over again. I was telling Susan yesterday, I bit my tongue recently, and it's really starting to hurt before it heals. I have been biting my tongue over and over again for decades. Within this room, there are collective, probably thousands of years of people biting tongues. We do it over and over and over again, we can't seem to learn. This is the essential cycle of ouch and recovery that continues throughout our lives. Teshuvah, that Hebrew concept for return, is another way to say ouch and recovery. It's a cycle between people. Teshuvah has no simple translation. Repentance, repair, and return, it means all of these. The word also literally means response, as in the answer to a question. It implies an exchange then, and often a series of exchanges. As Rabbi Janet Martyr explains, teshuvah and forgiveness arise from the contact of two human beings who meet in sincerity and humility to heal the breach between them. I believe that this humility is the beating heart of teshuvah. The Baal Shem Tov, a great Hasidic master, teaches that the world is a mirror, and the faults that we see in others are our own. The idea, I think, is not to blame or to shame the victim, but rather to say, the fault I see in you, I recognize in myself also, in potential if not in actuality. And I can imagine my own faults harming another as you have harmed me. I therefore release both of us from this burden. To forgive is to bow our heads in empathy, feeling the weight of our shared human frailty. We learn further from Maimonides that we should never harden our hearts to a penitent person. Rather, we should be quick to forgive and slow to anger, he says. I confess that this too I find incredibly challenging. Earlier this year, a friend called me on the phone to apologize for a serious hurt he had caused in breaking my trust in a way that was very personal. Taking his call, I felt resistant. I wasn't sure that he really understood what he had done wrong or how he made me feel. I just didn't want to forgive him. I also resented that a simple apology could somehow make up or erase such a heinous breach of trust. But then, there was that nagging voice of Maimonides in the back of my head, urging me to put the matter to rest. So I forgave him quickly, unspitefully, and unconditionally. It wasn't easy, but it was obviously the right thing to do. Perhaps, though, for a more serious offense, I would have relied on another teaching, which is that if we are not ready to forgive, we may turn the penitent person away even twice to ready our hearts first for reconciliation. When it comes to modern psychological thinking, there is a popular line of thinking that sees forgiveness as a gesture of self-care. Psychologist Fred Luskin, who's the founder of Stanford University's Forgiveness Project, says that it is not a favor to the person who wronged us to forgive, but rather a way to liberate ourselves from the anger that consumes us. That does not mean excusing the hurtful behavior. The word forgive, after all, simply means to let go. One may forgive at any time, even in the absence of contrition. That is essential because not every relationship can be repaired, and sometimes repair is only possible in the fullness of time. What if the offender shows no remorse, or has died, or the relationship has become unbearably toxic? Perhaps all of us can relate to one or more of these situations. In some situations, then, forgiveness simply means freeing ourselves from the punishing burden of negative emotions. That negativity can eat away at us. I have seen it over and again. Recently, someone came into my office to speak with me about cutting off a decades-old relationship with a close family member because of vicious political differences. We have a hard time initiating reconciliation because we feel that forgiving would be to excuse the harm of the past, or because we are so thoroughly convinced that we alone are right, or if we're honest, because on some level we still need the offender to suffer a little bit. But when we refuse to forgive, who really suffers? As the saying goes, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Perhaps that is one reason the Torah explicitly forbids vengefulness and grudge-bearing. Now, to be sure, this is all solid health advice. We can take care of ourselves by forgiving. I only hesitate that by reducing forgiveness to a unilateral gesture of self-care, we may avoid the hard work of reconciliation, which should be the primary goal whenever it is possible. The message of Judaism is that forgiveness is not a standalone activity. It is part of that dynamic process which we call teshuvah. You might be saying, though, aren't there sins that are beyond forgiveness? In his memoir, Holocaust survivor Simon Wiesenthal describes how a Nazi soldier called him a Jewish prisoner to his deathbed during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. The soldier had awoken to the heinous reality of his crimes. His conscience was on fire, and he needed to beg forgiveness from someone, anyone. What should Simon do? He was the only one there. How should he respond? How might you respond? One possible answer comes from a classic Jewish story. Many years ago in Eastern Europe, there was a great rabbi, a Talmud teacher from Brisk. He was acclaimed throughout the land for his scholarship. On one day, he is seated on a train going from Warsaw back home to Brisk. As he's reading his newspaper in his humble clothing, a very impressively dressed businessman passes by in search of a seat. Unaware that this ordinary-looking fellow is a great rabbi, the fancy businessman insists that the older man give up his seat, for he has much important work to do. So the businessman escorts him out of the compartment, where the rabbi stands for hours in the cold until they reach Brisk. Upon arrival, they see that a large crowd is gathering at the station platform. And the businessman thinks to himself, well, these people must be here to greet me, a famous businessman. But I think you already know where the story is going. That crowd is not for him. That crowd is there to greet the rabbi, who is, of course, a famous scholar. Immediately, the businessman runs to the rabbi to beg for his forgiveness. I'm so sorry, Rabbi. If I had known, I never would have dared. But the rabbi declines to forgive him. The businessman begs again, Rabbi, my apologies. Please, could you see it? Could you find it in your heart to forgive me? But again, the rabbi uncharacteristically turns away. So finally, the salesman, the businessman, goes to the rabbi's son, who is surprised that his compassionate father was being so unforgiving. He goes to his father and asks why. And the Brisker Rav replies, I cannot forgive him because he did not offend me. Had he known who I was, he never would have treated me that way. He offended a commoner, a stranger. Let the salesman go and ask him for forgiveness. Like the Brisker Rav, Simon Wiesenthal, when confronted by the dying Nazi guard, concluded that he could not fairly forgive the Nazi for crimes he had committed against so many others. And as for exceptionally grave crimes in our community, there are grave crimes in our community. We pray, God forbid, not so grave as the Shoah. But there are those of us who have encountered murder, sexual violence, parental abuse or abandonment. These may be beyond forgiveness. These may be beyond the pale. These may be beyond any possible reconciliation, at least in the human realm. When forgiveness is possible, though, it is almost always the right way forward. And Judaism believes that change is always possible. Peace is always possible, even when forgiveness is not. So what about those really big harms? Well, nations can do teshuvah too. Concerning the Shoah, the Holocaust, you may know that Germany has a remarkable history of rapprochement. It pays reparations to survivors. Denying the Holocaust there is a federal crime. In the center of Berlin sits a monument to the 6 million murdered by Germans. Now, this, of course, does not erase the very troubling rise of a resurgent ultra-nationalism and anti-Semitism going on there. But as a society, Germany has made moves to learn from the past. As Susan Neiman writes in her recent book, Learning from the Germans, a nation that erects a monument for shame for the evils of its history in its most prominent space is a nation that is not afraid to confront its own failures. What would collective teshuvah and forgiveness look like in our country? Can you imagine, for example, a monument to the national sin of slavery in the middle of Times Square? Or perhaps more to the point, can you picture cities in Florida, Alabama, Kentucky, even Washington, D.C., removing all of their monuments to the Confederacy, let alone building new monuments that reject the essential racist ideology of the Confederacy? As Neiman observes, Germany has no nostalgic Nazi memorials. Germany has no nostalgic Nazi memorials. Penitent nations confront their own failures publicly, painfully. They demonstrate a willingness to change and to make substantive efforts to heal what is broken. By these measures, our nation has a very long way to go. Penitent nations, though, are only made so by the compassion of their citizens. That's all of us, my friends. Every move toward love starts with one person, one heart. Mother Teresa taught, to bring peace into the whole world, first go home and love your family. When you feel that the weight of the world that the divisiveness and hate and acid thrown back and forth is too much to bear, is too much to fix. Go home and first love your family. Earlier, I mentioned the Torah characters, Jacob and Esau. Of the many stories about estranged brothers in the Torah, Jacob and Esau's is my favorite. As a young man, Jacob cheats his brother through theft, driving Esau to run away from home in anger. Time goes on, they both become wealthy and powerful, amass great wealth. When they confront one another years later, Esau comes out with soldiers in his vast encampment to challenge Jacob's own encampment, staged at the ready across a river. It's one of the most suspenseful scenes in the whole Torah. Who will draw first blood, we wonder? Well, in the end, their confrontation leads not to bloodshed, but to a tearful embrace. As they cry in one another's arms, they feel the healing power of forgiveness. Says Jacob to his brother, "Ra'iti panecha kirot panei Elohim." Seeing your face is like seeing the very face of God. He showers his brother Esau with love and gifts. "I have enough, my brother," Jacob tells him. "What I give you now is yours, and it can never be taken away." Somehow, in that moment, Jacob summons the courage to ask for forgiveness, and Esau finds the strength to forgive him. Neither heroes nor villains, just two flawed human beings meeting with the benefit of time and renewed compassion to heal the breach between them. The world is a mirror. The faults that we see in others are our own. The goodwill we presume in others is our own. The divinity that we see in others is our own. We're all wading through this messy life together, sometimes getting it right, many times getting it wrong. Yet still we care. Still we seek to return and repair, to forgive and to be forgiven. We all yearn for that one redemptive hug, that second chance. How can we get there this year? How might we right what went wrong this year? How soon can we swallow our pride, look at another person and say, "I see some of myself in you. I see some of you in me. And looking at you, I can see God looking back too."
It was a silly disagreement that led to one serious fight. Words were said and then some, and after all, I'm right. But as the time keeps passing and it's back to status quo, I realize I missed a step, and there's something you should know. I'm not always right. You're not always wrong. It's hard to get outside myself, but that's where I belong. So I can see myself as you do. It's the hardest thing to start, but if I'm honest with myself, I skip the "I'm sorry" part. Of course we just keep going, holding every grudge. That's called being human, and we're awfully quick to judge. But can we find our way back? It's not altogether clear to loving and forgiving at this time of year. I'm not always right. You're not always wrong. It's hard to get outside myself, but that's where I belong. So I can see myself as you do. Oh, it's the hardest thing to start. But if I'm honest with myself, I skip the I'm sorry part. You always hurt the one you love, waiting on a sign from up above. And sorry seems to be the hardest word. But beware my foolish pride, I let my conscience be my guide, and make this silent prayer be heard. I'm not always right, you're not always wrong. It's hard to get outside myself, I come on a little strong. But can I see myself as you do? I swear and cross my heart, and I'll be honest with myself, I skip the I'm sorry part. So let me say I'm sorry, and I pray we are free to say I'm sorry.